My name is Nora, and I was 18 years old when I realized that sometimes, the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally can treat you like you don't exist. That night, my 18th birthday, wasn't supposed to be extraordinary, just a small gathering of friends, cupcakes, fairy lights strung across the backyard, and laughter echoing into the evening. I had spent days planning, making sure every detail was just right. I bought cupcakes from the bakery down the street, sprinkled colored confetti on the table, and even hung a banner that read Happy 18th Nora, in bold letters. I was excited, hopeful, and for once, I imagined the night being about me. But that morning, before the sun had fully risen, before the warmth of the day even started, my brother Ethan came home. He slammed the front door so hard that the frames on the wall rattled, pictures shaking in their crooked little mounts. He stomped past me without a glance, his face red and contorted in anger, carrying the fury of some imagined injustice. I didn't know what had happened yet, but soon enough, I found out. The road trip he had planned with his friends, a concert, loud music, freedom on wheels, had collapsed because of a car breakdown. His week, in his mind, had been ruined. And somehow, in his eyes, that meant my birthday had to be ruined too. I watched, frozen in disbelief, as my mom, Karen, immediately shifted. 1 second she was scrolling her phone, texting her coworkers, her face neutral, and the next, her eyes went soft and guilty, almost pleading. Hours later, she had sent texts to my friends, telling them the party was cancelled because I was not feeling well. No consultation, no asking if I was okay with it, just a message sent with a flick of her finger and the assumption that she was protecting someone from disappointment. My own mother had cancelled my birthday because my brother couldn't have his week the way he wanted. I stood in the kitchen, holding a tray of frosted cupcakes, my heart sinking into the tiles beneath me. They weren't even hiding the deception. My mom's messages said I was sick, feverish, too unwell to celebrate, while Ethan sulked in the living room, the center of attention despite the chaos he had caused. My dad, Mike, hovered silently, unwilling to intervene, as if neutrality could somehow erase the injustice I was feeling. And there I was, an 18-year-old who had looked forward to this day for months, completely erased. That was the moment something inside me cracked. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a tantrum. I didn't even cry. I just quietly walked to my room, shutting the door behind me with a sense of finality I had never experienced before. For years, I had been the quiet, invisible one, the child who didn't matter when plans were made or attention was distributed unevenly. I had learned to fade into the background, to accept that my successes, my happiness, and even my birthdays were negotiable, subject to someone else's whims. But this was different. This was deliberate. Before I packed my things, I thought back to all the other times my needs had been secondary. Movie nights where I sat on the cold floor while Ethan curled up on the couch, laughing at how my song suggestions were terrible. Road trips where my input was ignored and my ideas were dismissed. Gifts that were half-baked afterthoughts for me while Ethan received the latest gadgets, trips, and experiences. Every small instance stacked itself into one towering weight that pressed on my chest, and in that moment, I realized I didn't need their permission, their attention, or even their acknowledgement anymore. I started packing my things quietly, methodically. A backpack for essentials, a small bag for clothes, a few personal items that represented my life outside their control. I didn't have a clear plan beyond getting out. I didn't know where I would go, how I would spend the evening, or what the immediate future held. What I did know was that staying in that house meant continuing to be invisible, swallowed by a family hierarchy that placed Ethan at the center and me as an afterthought. My hands moved almost automatically, filling the bags, stacking my books, tucking away a notebook with sketches and ideas I had never shared with them. It was almost surreal to be leaving on what was supposed to be my special day. I paused at the door, hand on the knob, listening to the house. The faint ticking of a clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of Ethan muttering angrily about how his plans were ruined. My mom's voice floated faintly from the kitchen, a rehearsed mix of sympathy and guilt, telling herself that she was handling it all for the best. My dad's low murmur echoed somewhere between the rooms, trying to mediate but ultimately saying nothing that mattered. The house felt heavy, oppressive, like it was holding me back physically and emotionally. I didn't slam the door. I didn't shout. I just stepped out quietly, leaving behind all the baked goods, decorations, and the invisible weight I had carried for years. Walking down the front steps, I felt a strange combination of relief and fear. Relief because I had finally asserted control over my own life, fear because I had no idea what would come next. The crisp evening air hit me, sharp and real, and for the first time, I felt like I was taking a step into a world that didn't revolve around someone else's whims. I started walking, my backpack light in comparison to the weight lifted from my shoulders. The streets were quiet, the neighborhood familiar yet distant in a way that made my home feel like a memory rather than a present reality. I didn't have a destination, just a determination to be away from the center of a family system that had consistently prioritized Ethan's needs over mine. Each step felt like a declaration: I am here. I exist. My feelings matter. My time matters. My life matters. For years, I had whispered that to myself in the shadows. Now, I was speaking it aloud, silently, with every footstep. As I walked, I replayed moments in my mind, cataloging the years of subtle favoritism and neglect. Birthday after birthday, holiday after holiday, achievement after achievement, Ethan was celebrated and encouraged while my presence was acknowledged only minimally, with vague assurances that I would be fine, that I didn't need anything special, that I could manage on my own. And I had. I had survived, adapted, and grown into someone capable of handling life without their recognition or support. But tonight, something shifted. I realized I didn't have to just survive. I could take charge. I could redefine the terms. Hours passed as I wandered aimlessly, letting the city lights guide me. I thought about my future, about the independence I had worked for, about the skills and passions I had cultivated quietly, away from the spotlight that always shone on Ethan. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life where I was the center, where my happiness didn't depend on the moods or approval of others. And in that vision, I found clarity. I understood that this moment, being overlooked, dismissed, erased, was not a tragedy. It was an opportunity. It was a signal that I needed to step out of their shadow entirely. By the time I returned to my small apartment later that night, I had made decisions that would shape the next months and years of my life. I wasn't coming back to my parents' house for convenience, for celebration, or for acknowledgement. I was building a world where my voice mattered, where my achievements were mine alone, and where no tantrum, no favoritism, no arbitrary decision could erase my existence. That night, as I unpacked my few belongings, I made a silent promise: I would never allow anyone else's priorities to dictate the trajectory of my life. I would reclaim my birthdays, my milestones, my happiness, and my voice. That first night of being intentionally absent, of walking away from my family's expectations and emotional manipulation, became the foundation for everything that followed. I had discovered the power of agency, the strength of boundaries, and the importance of self-respect. From that quiet, lonely apartment, I began to sketch out plans, ideas, and visions for a life that was truly mine. I wrote in notebooks, journaled my thoughts, and slowly started to see the blueprint for independence and success forming before me. The anger, frustration, and sadness from the day were transformed into determination, a quiet fire that fueled every decision. By the end of that night, I realized that leaving wasn't just a physical act. It was symbolic. It was a declaration of self-worth. I had been the invisible child, the one dismissed, the one whose birthday didn't matter. But walking out had changed the story. I was no longer invisible. My actions, my choices, and my future were now mine to control. And in that control, I found freedom, clarity, and the first taste of what it meant to truly live for myself. The days after my departure from my parents' house were surreal. I wasn't just dealing with the aftermath of my birthday being cancelled, I was confronting the reality that my entire family dynamic had been skewed against me for years. I had left, yes, but leaving didn't erase the memories, the dismissals, or the emotional patterns I had internalized. At first, the apartment felt empty, almost too quiet. I was surrounded by my possessions, yet there was a strange hollow where my home had been, a place filled with the familiar faces, smells, and routines that I had been forced to abandon. I realized quickly that freedom came with an unexpected weight, the responsibility of facing life without their guidance, interference, or validation. I immersed myself in daily routines, both to distract myself and to establish a sense of control that had been absent in my life. I cooked my own meals, organized my small living space, and even started a strict schedule for school, work, and self-improvement. What had once been minor annoyances at home, small acts of disrespect, interruptions, or dismissals, now became sources of empowerment. For the first time, I was making decisions purely based on what I wanted and what was best for me. I went to the local library, discovered quiet corners and cafes, and found myself reflecting on years of overlooked birthdays, unacknowledged achievements, and the countless ways I had been secondary. But the most significant change was internal. Leaving my parents' house that night had not only removed me from a toxic environment, it had sparked a shift in my mindset. I stopped measuring my worth through their approval. Every small act of independence, the simple act of paying my own bills, deciding what to eat, or choosing how to spend an evening, became a victory. I began documenting my thoughts and experiences in a journal, noting not only my feelings of frustration and betrayal but also the empowering moments of reclaiming control. Each page was a step toward understanding that my life was mine, not something to be dictated by my brother's moods or my parents' inconsistent priorities. Meanwhile, word of my absence inevitably reached my family. My mom called once, her voice shaky, attempting a combination of guilt and apology. "Nora, I didn't realize, we didn't mean to," she stammered, but I didn't answer. I had learned over the years that engaging in their justifications often led to compromise or further manipulation. My dad sent a text, "We're worried about you. Please come back soon." But worry without accountability wasn't enough. They wanted the comfort of knowing I was still within reach, without confronting the systemic favoritism and emotional neglect that had driven me away. And Ethan sent a series of messages that ranged from sulky complaints to indirect blame, implying that I had overreacted. I ignored all of them. My silence was my boundary. Isolation, however, wasn't loneliness. Initially, the apartment felt isolating, and I wondered if I had made a mistake. But soon, I realized that this distance from my family allowed me to see things clearly. I began analyzing patterns I had overlooked before, the ways Ethan's tantrums were always prioritized, the subtle ways my achievements were downplayed, and the constant expectation that I would adjust to accommodate the moods and desires of others. The perspective from outside the household gave me clarity, revealing not only the inequities but also the emotional habits I had unconsciously adopted, apologizing when I had done nothing wrong, shrinking when attention was scarce, and dismissing my own needs to maintain peace. I also started investing more in relationships that were reciprocal and supportive. Friends who had reached out after hearing about my birthday cancellation became my unexpected lifeline. They celebrated me in ways my family never had. We went for late-night drives, shared ice cream, laughed until our stomachs hurt, and talked about dreams that didn't involve anyone else's approval. For the first time, I experienced birthdays not as obligations but as genuine celebrations of my existence. These moments, small but profound, contrasted sharply with years of neglect and favoritism. They reminded me that validation could exist outside my family and that love and attention weren't tied exclusively to blood relations. As the week progressed, I found myself observing my family from a distance in a more literal sense. I had friends who occasionally passed by my old neighborhood, giving me updates. Through their stories, I learned that life at home was chaotic, even for my family. My brother's tantrums continued, now escalating because my absence had disrupted his perceived control. My mother seemed more distracted than ever, attempting to juggle appeasing him and maintaining a semblance of normalcy. My father, meanwhile, tried to mediate but often failed to address the deeper issues of favoritism and unequal treatment. While I felt a pang of sadness initially, I also recognized the clarity that distance brought. I could see the dysfunction for what it was without being consumed by it. During this period, I also discovered a sense of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. Without the habitual safety net of my parents' home, I learned to manage my finances, navigate errands independently, and even handle unexpected challenges like a broken washing machine or a missed appointment. Each problem I solved reinforced a sense of competence, a realization that I didn't need constant oversight or validation. This confidence became a powerful counterweight to the emotional turmoil that had characterized my home life. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving in ways I hadn't imagined possible. As the days turned into weeks, the anger I had felt on my birthday evolved into something more nuanced. Initially, it had been raw, consuming, and bitter, fueled by the blatant disregard for my feelings. But now, from the distance I had created, I began to understand the deeper emotional dynamics at play. My mother's decision to prioritize Ethan wasn't entirely conscious cruelty, it was the product of patterns she had normalized over years. Ethan's tantrums, though frustrating, were a form of learned behavior amplified by a system that always gave him the upper hand. Recognizing this didn't excuse their actions, but it gave me the perspective to focus on my growth rather than dwelling solely on resentment. I also began documenting the story, not for social media or validation, but for myself. Each entry in my journal detailed what had happened, my emotional responses, and the lessons I was learning. I wrote about the night my birthday was canceled, the realization of my invisibility, and the steps I was taking to reclaim agency. I wrote about the small victories, managing a grocery list without interference, cooking a meal that I actually enjoyed, spending an evening in quiet reflection. Writing became both a therapeutic release and a strategic exercise, reinforcing the independence I was cultivating and creating a record of resilience that I could revisit whenever self-doubt crept in. By the end of the second week, I began to see the world differently. I no longer measured my worth based on familial approval or emotional manipulation. I recognized that while my family had shaped me, they didn't define me. Their actions were theirs to reconcile, not mine to internalize. And most importantly, I realized that life outside their immediate sphere offered both freedom and opportunity. I was free to celebrate milestones, pursue dreams, and live authentically. I was free to prioritize my happiness without guilt or apology. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, not by my family, but by myself. By the third week of my independence, I began to notice a subtle, almost surreal shift in the narrative of my family's life, at least from the fragments I could observe from a distance. I had friends occasionally updating me, and sometimes, I caught glimpses on social media. What I saw was fascinating, almost like watching a slow-motion experiment in cause and effect. My absence wasn't just an inconvenience for them, it had disrupted the fragile balance they had maintained for years. Without me there to absorb tension, manage household chores, or silently mediate my brother's outbursts, the house seemed to wobble under its own dysfunction. Ethan's tantrums, once conveniently contained by my compliance, now escalated with no buffer, and my parents' attempts to appease him created visible cracks in their own patience. It was a mixture of validation and disbelief. On one hand, I felt vindicated. All those years of my needs being overlooked, all the sacrifices I had made to keep peace, and all the moments I had been dismissed as dramatic or ungrateful suddenly made sense. It wasn't me who was the problem. It was the system my family had maintained, one that prioritized Ethan's emotions over fairness, maturity, or logic. Yet, on the other hand, I felt a pang of concern. I wasn't cruel, and despite everything, I still cared about my parents and brother. But I understood that sometimes, care didn't mean interfering or sacrificing your own well-being. Watching them struggle without me was a strange kind of justice, yes, but also an opportunity for me to step fully into adulthood without guilt. One afternoon, I received a video from a friend who had visited my old neighborhood. It showed my mother, frazzled, trying to manage Ethan while my father sat quietly, clearly unsure how to intervene. Ethan was throwing a small tantrum, stomping his feet, shouting at anyone who came near. My mother's voice was raised, but the calm control she normally exerted over my younger brother was absent. It was the first time I saw her so clearly as human, fallible, overwhelmed, and inconsistent. My father tried to calm Ethan, but his attempts were awkward, almost helpless. The video didn't make me laugh, it didn't give me joy in a schadenfreude sense. Instead, it confirmed something crucial. The stability I had once thought was normal in our family had always been fragile, conditional, and entirely dependent on me being the silent mediator. I started reflecting deeply on how much emotional labor I had been performing for years. It wasn't just about birthdays or tantrums, it was about constantly managing moods, smoothing over conflicts, and sacrificing my own time and happiness so that the household appeared functional. I realized that my independence wasn't just personal liberation, it was also an awakening to how much work I had done unnoticed. Suddenly, my cancelled birthday felt less like a single event and more like the final straw in a long history of systemic neglect and favoritism. Every decision my parents made, every compromise I had been forced to accept, and every instance where my voice was secondary had contributed to a dynamic that kept me small while elevating Ethan. Around this time, I also began receiving messages from mutual acquaintances who had witnessed snippets of family interactions. They described arguments where Ethan's demands dominated conversations, moments when my mother seemed exhausted and apologetic yet unable to change patterns, and times when my father appeared frustrated but passive. These reports painted a clear picture. My departure had not broken the family, but it had disrupted their comfort zone, forcing them to confront challenges they had long ignored. While part of me wanted to intervene, I reminded myself that stepping back was part of the necessary process. My absence allowed them to face reality without my interference, and in some twisted way, that was more constructive than my constant mediation ever had been. In my own life, I continued to build routines that prioritized growth and self-respect. I started a small freelance project, something I had always dreamed of but never had the confidence to pursue. I dedicated time each day to skill building, networking, and creating tangible outcomes that were entirely my own. The contrast between my achievements and the turmoil I observed in my family was stark. I realized that leaving had not only given me emotional space, it had provided the practical bandwidth to invest in myself fully. Every completed task, every small milestone, was a reminder that life could be organized, productive, and fulfilling when I didn't have to navigate constant familial favoritism. Interestingly, this period also taught me about empathy and perspective. Despite my justified anger, I recognized that my parents were products of their own upbringing, carrying forward patterns they had learned and internalized. Ethan's behavior, though frustrating and sometimes cruel, was a symptom of systemic imbalance rather than inherent malice. I didn't need to forgive to move forward, but I needed to understand that anger alone would not serve me. Understanding the roots of their actions allowed me to release some of the emotional weight I had been carrying for years. It also gave me a framework for setting boundaries that were firm yet compassionate. I could care without sacrificing my own needs or being complicit in dysfunctional dynamics. One evening, I decided to visit a nearby park, journal in hand, and reflect on the changes in my life and theirs. Sitting on a bench under the fading light, I wrote about the lessons I had learned, the importance of self-prioritization, the need for emotional independence, and the realization that family dynamics do not define personal worth. I recounted the small victories, from cooking my first solo meal to handling client communications without stress, and I documented the moments of clarity that had come from observing my family from a distance. Each entry strengthened my resolve to continue forging a life where my happiness was central, where celebrations were genuine, and where emotional labor was reciprocated rather than taken for granted. Meanwhile, snippets of my family's life continued to filter through. My mother attempted to reschedule celebrations for both Ethan and me, but without the natural rhythm I had maintained, the attempts seemed awkward and strained. My brother, now emboldened by my absence, continued to assert control over every interaction, pushing boundaries without consequence. My father oscillated between frustration and detachment, clearly struggling to assert authority or fairness. Watching this unfold in fragmented glimpses reinforced a vital lesson. My presence had been a stabilizing force, yes, but my absence allowed me to step fully into adulthood, untethered from the chaos I had long been forced to navigate. During this time, I also began to think critically about reconciliation. I didn't want to return to the old patterns, but I wasn't opposed to creating a new relationship framework, one that respected boundaries, promoted fairness, and acknowledged past mistakes. I realized that any future interaction with my family would require honesty, clarity, and assertiveness. Silence, while protective, was temporary. Long-term peace would require communication that recognized both my growth and the systemic issues I had endured. But for now, I focused on observing, reflecting, and strengthening my independence, knowing that any decision about reconnection had to come from a place of empowerment rather than obligation. By the end of the third week, I began to feel a mix of pride and relief. Pride in my ability to create a life on my terms, and relief in knowing that my absence wasn't a failure but a statement of self-respect. The cancelled birthday, once a wound that felt permanent, had become a catalyst for growth, perspective, and clarity. I had learned to observe without interference, to value my achievements independently, and to recognize the patterns that had limited me for years. The story of my family, their struggles, and their reactions had become a living case study, a reminder that independence was both a privilege and a responsibility, one that I intended to honor fully. By the fourth month of living independently, the dynamics within my family had shifted in ways I could never have predicted, and yet they seemed almost inevitable. My absence was no longer a temporary disruption, it had become a permanent variable that altered every interaction, decision, and expectation. I noticed through social media and mutual friends' updates that my mother, who once thrived on orchestrating the household to prevent conflicts, was now visibly drained. Her attempts to balance Ethan's whims with the mundane responsibilities of everyday life were becoming increasingly erratic. For the first time, I could see her not as the all-knowing, omnipotent parent figure I had grown up with, but as a human being susceptible to stress, fatigue, and poor decision-making. It was enlightening and somewhat unsettling. Ethan, on the other hand, appeared to be at the peak of both his liberty and his frustration. Without me around to subtly negotiate compromises or preemptively address his demands, he experienced a new level of freedom, one that often manifested in chaos. He pushed boundaries with even greater intensity, expecting instant gratification for every whim, and his tantrums became more frequent and unrestrained. My friends shared videos of arguments that lasted for hours, each one ending with my parents conceding something just to restore temporary peace. Watching this unfold from a distance was surreal. On one hand, I felt vindicated, on the other, I felt a twinge of discomfort. There was no joy in witnessing dysfunction escalate, but there was a profound clarity in observing the consequences of favoritism and inconsistency. In the meantime, I had begun to solidify routines and habits that prioritized both my emotional well-being and my personal growth. I cultivated a daily schedule that balanced work, learning, and leisure, activities that I had previously sacrificed to maintain family harmony. Each small success reinforced the sense of agency I had been missing for years. Paying bills on time, cooking meals that reflected my taste, managing client projects efficiently, and even setting aside time for hobbies that brought me joy, all of these actions were subtle but powerful assertions of independence. In contrast, my family seemed to flounder, often unable to accomplish even basic tasks without friction. The juxtaposition was striking, a living illustration of the benefits of accountability, self-discipline, and proactive engagement with one's life. During this period, I also reflected on the emotional consequences of my parents' choices. The cancellation of my 18th birthday had been symbolic, but it was also indicative of a larger pattern. My needs were consistently deprioritized in favor of my brother's emotional comfort. This realization deepened my understanding of family dynamics, as well as the psychological impact of growing up in a household where favoritism dictated outcomes. It became increasingly clear why I had felt overlooked, dismissed, and frustrated for so many years. This insight did not fuel resentment in a destructive way, rather, it strengthened my resolve to never compromise my self-worth for the sake of appeasing someone else. Independence was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. Interestingly, the unfolding drama at home also shed light on my parents' limitations. My mother, though nurturing and loving in many respects, was often reactive rather than proactive, making decisions based on immediate emotional pressures rather than rational planning. My father, who had always been more passive, seemed to struggle with authority and assertiveness, especially when confronted with Ethan's escalating demands. Without me present as the intermediary, they were forced to confront their own shortcomings. From afar, I could see patterns repeating, concessions made to avoid conflict, delayed responsibilities, and a constant undercurrent of stress that permeated their interactions. These observations confirmed what I had suspected all along, that my departure, while difficult emotionally, was necessary for everyone to face reality. As weeks turned into months, I also noticed shifts in the way my family portrayed themselves publicly. Social media posts that had once highlighted harmonious gatherings now included hints of frustration or imbalance. Photos of Ethan smiling often masked moments of tension behind the scenes, while my parents' captions sometimes betrayed passive guilt or defensiveness. It was fascinating to observe the discrepancy between public perception and private reality, a discrepancy I had experienced firsthand while living under their roof. This duality reinforced the importance of authenticity in my own life. I was determined to create a reality where appearances matched experience, where celebrations and milestones were genuine, and where emotions were acknowledged rather than suppressed or manipulated. During this phase, I also began receiving more direct updates from friends who had visited my home or communicated with my parents. They reported that Ethan had become more insistent, often issuing ultimatums that my parents struggled to manage. My mother, exhausted and overwhelmed, sometimes broke down emotionally, revealing the immense pressure she had been under for years to placate both of her children while maintaining the illusion of harmony. My father, meanwhile, oscillated between frustration and helplessness, attempting to mediate conflicts with little success. Each account was a stark reminder that my absence had removed the stabilizing force I had unwittingly provided, forcing the household to confront its dysfunction in a raw, unfiltered way. This period also prompted deep personal reflection on my role in the family. I realized that much of my adolescence had been spent managing others' emotions at the expense of my own. I had internalized responsibility for outcomes that were not mine to control, and I had often blamed myself when conflicts escalated despite my best efforts. Observing the fallout from my absence clarified a crucial truth: the family's challenges were systemic, not personal. My efforts had maintained a temporary equilibrium, but they had not addressed the underlying issues. Recognizing this distinction was liberating. It allowed me to let go of guilt, embrace my independence fully, and appreciate that personal growth sometimes requires stepping away from familiar yet unbalanced environments. By now, I had also begun to develop strategies for managing future interactions with my family. I understood that maintaining boundaries would be essential, as would prioritizing fairness and accountability in any engagement. I started mentally rehearsing conversations that acknowledged past grievances without escalating conflict, asserting my needs without guilt, and establishing new norms that would prevent repetition of previous dynamics. This preparation was empowering. I no longer felt trapped by my family's expectations or burdened by the emotional labor I had previously shouldered. Instead, I approached potential reconciliation from a place of strength and self-respect, ready to redefine relationships on terms that reflected my maturity and autonomy. Finally, this period underscored the transformative power of observation and reflection. Watching my family navigate life without me provided invaluable insights into human behavior, the consequences of favoritism, and the importance of self-prioritization. I realized that leaving had not just been an act of rebellion or escape, it had been a deliberate choice to protect my well-being, assert my independence, and cultivate a life defined by my own values. Each update, each video, each anecdote I received reinforced the lessons I had learned and strengthened my resolve to live intentionally, authentically, and without compromise. By the end of the 4th month, the narrative was clear. I had grown into someone capable of managing life, relationships, and responsibilities on my own terms. My family, meanwhile, was confronting the consequences of decisions they had long taken for granted. Observing this from a distance provided perspective, clarity, and closure, emotional tools I would carry forward as I continued to build a life that celebrated my worth, honored my boundaries, and embraced independence as a cornerstone of personal fulfillment. By the time the 5th month rolled around, the changes within my family had become undeniable, and the consequences of my decision to leave were unfolding in ways both dramatic and revealing. What had started as an act of self-preservation, the choice to step away after my 18th birthday was cancelled, had evolved into a full-scale examination of character, priorities, and family dynamics. From a distance, I could witness patterns that had been invisible while I lived under the same roof, patterns that now screamed with clarity. The household no longer operated on the delicate pretense of equilibrium. Every action and reaction reflected the underlying imbalances that my presence had temporarily masked. My departure had created a vacuum, and the fallout was as instructive as it was uncomfortable. Ethan's behavior continued to dominate the household. Without my presence to diffuse his tantrums or negotiate compromises, he had learned that his demands often carried disproportionate weight. Yet, paradoxically, the longer he remained unchecked, the more he revealed his own vulnerabilities. His confidence was increasingly performative, a facade covering insecurity and fear of losing attention. I watched through stories and social media posts as moments of defiance were frequently punctuated by exhaustion, disappointment, or confrontation. My parents were no longer able to shield him from the natural consequences of his actions, and those consequences were beginning to accumulate in ways that were impossible to ignore. It was a difficult spectacle, but it also underscored a fundamental truth: unchecked behavior eventually reveals itself, no matter how loud or persistent it initially appears. Meanwhile, my parents were confronting realities they had long deferred. My mother, who had often prioritized Ethan's comfort over fairness, was now grappling with the stress of managing a household in which her decisions were constantly questioned, both by her son and by circumstance. Her fatigue was palpable in the photos and messages I received. She struggled to balance household responsibilities with emotional support for both children, yet the imbalance that had defined our past was now more visible than ever. My father, who had often played a passive role, began to assert himself more frequently, though awkwardly, as he attempted to manage the household. There were moments of tension, frustration, and outright conflict, yet these moments were teaching all of them lessons about accountability, fairness, and the limits of indulgence. From my perspective, living independently had transformed me in ways that were impossible to quantify. Every challenge I faced, paying rent, managing bills, navigating workplace expectations, and maintaining a social life, was a lesson in resilience, self-reliance, and decision-making. I learned to anticipate consequences rather than react to crises, to communicate clearly rather than manipulate situations indirectly, and to set boundaries that safeguarded my mental and emotional well-being. Observing my family's struggles from afar only reinforced these lessons, offering a mirror in which I could see how different my life could have been had I remained enmeshed in the same cycle of conflict and favoritism. Independence had granted me clarity, perspective, and a newfound sense of agency that I could never have developed under constant parental intervention. During this period, I also noticed shifts in how my family interacted with each other. The initial chaos had gradually evolved into a more honest, though often uncomfortable, acknowledgement of limits and responsibilities. My parents were forced to confront Ethan's entitlement, and in doing so, they began to establish boundaries that had previously been absent. These moments were small but significant victories for fairness and structure. Ethan's realization that not every whim could be immediately fulfilled led to moments of reflection, frustration, and occasionally even self-awareness. It was a slow process, and the road was littered with setbacks, yet there was progress, evidence that my absence had catalyzed a necessary reckoning. Simultaneously, I began reflecting on the emotional ramifications of my choice to leave. Initially, guilt had been unavoidable. I questioned whether my departure had been selfish, whether I had abandoned my family in a time of need. Yet, as the months unfolded, I understood that my leaving was not an act of abandonment, it was an act of survival and self-preservation. By stepping away, I not only protected my own mental and emotional health but also allowed my family to confront the consequences of their actions and decisions. The postponement of these lessons while I remained at home had only perpetuated cycles of favoritism, conflict, and frustration. My absence accelerated growth and understanding, even if it came at the cost of temporary chaos. Interestingly, this distance also allowed me to witness my parents' growth. My mother, once reactive and often overwhelmed, began making decisions with greater deliberation. She no longer gave in instantly to tantrums or demands, but rather took time to assess fairness and long-term consequences. My father, too, started to find his voice, asserting authority in ways that had been rare when I lived under the same roof. These changes were subtle yet transformative. While my family's journey was far from perfect, it was now grounded in accountability rather than avoidance, and this shift offered me a sense of reassurance and closure. As I watched the evolving dynamics, I also realized how much my own identity had strengthened. Living independently had forced me to define my boundaries, values, and priorities without relying on external validation. I had learned to celebrate my milestones in my own way, create traditions that resonated with me, and build a life that reflected my personal goals and desires. The pain of having my 18th birthday cancelled had gradually transformed into a catalyst for empowerment. What initially felt like a betrayal became an opportunity to reclaim agency, understand relational patterns, and shape the trajectory of my life intentionally. In addition, I began exploring the psychological aspects of family behavior more deeply. Favoritism, entitlement, and avoidance of consequences are patterns that can perpetuate dysfunction across generations. By observing my family, I gained insight into these dynamics without the distortion of personal entanglement. I could analyze cause and effect, see the ripple effects of parental decisions, and appreciate the importance of fairness and consistency in fostering healthy relationships. This knowledge was not just theoretical. It informed my approach to friendships, romantic relationships, and professional interactions, equipping me with the tools to cultivate respect, accountability, and mutual understanding. By the 5th month, I also witnessed the impact of my absence on family milestones and interactions. Holidays, birthdays, and social events were no longer orchestrated around my presence or preferences. The consequences of decisions made under stress became visible. Moments of tension at gatherings, overlooked responsibilities, and minor conflicts that could have been mediated by my involvement now played out in real time. Observing these instances reinforced the lessons I had internalized about fairness, self-worth, and the importance of boundaries. It became clear that personal growth and family growth are not always synchronous, and sometimes stepping away is necessary for both to evolve independently. Finally, the culmination of these months provided a profound sense of perspective. I understood that my decision to leave had initiated a chain reaction. My family was forced to confront discomfort and responsibility, and I had created a space to cultivate independence and resilience. The initial heartbreak, frustration, and anger I felt over my cancelled birthday had transformed into clarity, empowerment, and self-respect. I realized that sometimes, stepping away is not an act of rebellion but an act of wisdom. Observing my family's life from a distance allowed me to appreciate both their struggles and their growth, while simultaneously affirming the strength, maturity, and autonomy I had gained. This journey left me with lessons that would shape my future indefinitely. I had learned that self-worth cannot be negotiated for the comfort of others, that independence fosters clarity and personal growth, and that witnessing consequences can teach far more than intervening prematurely. My 18th birthday, once a symbol of disappointment and favoritism, had ultimately become a turning point, a catalyst for reflection, transformation, and the cultivation of a life defined on my own terms.